Hi again. This Freedom Whence, John Wesley Bready, is in the chapter The Shaping of a Crusade. That's page 132 of this Freedom Whence. He's got the revival going in the 1740s and 50s. Things are changing fast because of the discipline of those early Methodists. He goes on about the itinerant preachers. The creation, too, of local and itinerant preachers was forced upon the movement by the march of events. Few ministers, Anglican or nonconformist, were at first friendly to the revival. Almost none were willing to give assistance to the man who had the world for his parish. Wesley, Whitefield, and Brother Charles were tireless in their efforts, but the harvest was too great for their gleaning. More laborers had to be found. It was the old story of Jesus and the apostles. Wesley, like his master, had to accept the best messengers available. In the critical case of Thomas Maxfield, who became a force in the early days, Wesley's mother had a decisive influence. High church as she had been all her life, her advice to her son was revolutionary. Take care what you do with respect to this young man, for he is as surely called of God to preach as you are. With the settlement of Maxfield's case, the lay preacher became an institution, but henceforth these preachers were chosen by Wesley himself, and cheerfully did they submit to the rigorous discipline he imposed. Quite apart from Whitefield's preaching disciples, Wesley finally was directing some 700 local and itinerant preachers, and the heroism of these rustic missionaries forms one of the romances of history. A romance whose full significance has never yet been penned, for it is an epic of adventure and achievement. If ever men were baptized in the fires of privation and persecution, these veterans were. A study of some of their portraits, assembled in the standard edition of Wesley's journal, challenges the imagination and points the fact that they were men of no common metal. By their arduous labors of love, the dross of selfishness was burned away, and the gold of the Spirit was burnished bright. Of these preachers, Southey says, quote, St. Francis and his followers did not commit themselves with more confidence to the care of Providence, nor with more entire disregard for all human means. End of quote. And who will question this conclusion? For these virile messengers of the cross, no weather was too inclement, no road too boggy, no ford too swollen, no community too degraded, no mob too violent, no privation too severe to interfere with their round of duty. Christ, their master, pointed the way, and Wesley, their captain, set them a living example. But as Wesley grew old, he became a revered national character. Vulliamy pronounces him finally the best-loved man in England. Certainly many a former enemy chose ultimately to regard him as a fellow of Oxford, a fine old English gentleman and a benefactor of the poor. With the humble veterans, the case was different. The fires of persecution, fanned by the winds of bigotry, still raged along their trail. Yet cheerful, unafraid, they labored on. After the imprisonment of one of his preachers, Wesley wrote, I pray you, for what pay could we procure men to do this service? To be always ready to go to prison or to death. Nelson, Maxfield, and other itinerant preachers were carried off by army press gangs. Thomas Mitchell was thrown repeatedly into a deep pond till he was insensible. Then his clothes were covered with paint. William Seward, who had accompanied Whitefield on his second voyage to America, was blinded in 1741 by one Welsh rabble and killed by another. Several preachers went to premature graves through injuries inflicted by mobs. Others were maimed or scarred for life. Some in their excessive labors burned themselves out. Some died in harness, leaving from 6pence to 6 shillings of worldly wealth. But always the gaps were filled, and always the ranks increased. Like seasoned veterans, on and on they marched. John Pritchard's horse one winter became incapacitated, and meanwhile he journeyed 1,200 miles on foot. Thomas Oliver's traveled not less than 100,000 miles on one horse, no mean tribute to his care of the beast that shared his labors. These trailbreakers, like Wesley, rode every morning at 4 and preached most mornings at 5. They refrained from all intoxicants, lived lives of marked abstemiousness, and commonly divided each day into 3 parts: 8 hours for sleeping and eating, 8 for study and meditation, 8 for preaching, visitation, and social labors. Dr. Robinson, Archbishop of Armagh, once complained to Charles Wesley concerning the use of lay preachers. Charles replied, "The fault is yours and your brethren's." "How so?" inquired the astonished prelate. "Because you hold your peace and the stones cry out," he rejoined. "But I am told," retorted his grace, "that they are unlearned men." "Some are," Charles confessed, and so the dumb ass rebukes the prophet. Yet bearing in mind the discipline to which these preachers cheerfully submitted themselves, and the courses of reading which Wesley, the one-time Oxford Don, regularly prescribed and supervised, they could not long remain unlearned men. Wesley's defense of them was fully justified. In the one thing which they profess to know, he protested, "They are not ignorant men. I trust there is not one of them who is not able to go through such an examination is substantial, practical, experimental divinity, as few of our graduates for holy orders, even in the university, I speak it with sorrow and shame and in tender love, are able to do." Michael Sadler, the social reformer and instigator of the classic parliamentary report on factory children's labor, that's 1831-32, in his treatise An Apology for the Methodists, published in 1797, maintained that the ignorance of the revival's preachers was maliciously exaggerated. Many of these preachers, he contended, became men of higher mental attainment than their assailants. And if Sadler himself were a fair example, they included men of rare talents. Wesley not only supervised the education of his preachers, but insisted that they in turn become mediums of education among the people. "Preach expressly on education," he insisted. And to anyone who objected, "But I have no gift for this," his reply was peremptory: "Gift or no gift, you are to do it, else you are not called to be a Methodist preacher. Do it as you can, till you can do it as you would. Pray earnestly for the gift, and use the means for it." Next time, more about the necessity Wesley laid upon all his preachers and class leaders to do extensive reading.